German Shepherd and puppy enter police station. The officer's reaction shocks everyone. The storm had rolled in faster than expected, draping the town in darkness and sheets of rain that pounded the streets without mercy. Inside the small-town police station, Officer Daniel Johnson leaned back in his chair, rubbing tired eyes as the night shift stretched endlessly ahead. The glow of the computer screen bathed his desk in dim light, his fingers idly flipping through paperwork when a sudden, frantic scratching at the door shattered the quiet. He exchanged a puzzled glance with Officer Torres, who sat across from him, mid-sip of lukewarm coffee. "Did you hear that?" Torres muttered, placing his cup down. Another scratch, more desperate this time, followed by a low whimper. Johnson rose cautiously, placing a hand on the grip of his holstered weapon out of habit. He moved toward the door, heart quickening as a heavy thud hit the wood. Then another. The sound was urgent, pleading. When he pulled the door open, the sight before him sent a cold shock through his veins. A German Shepherd, soaked to the bone, her fur caked in mud, trembled on the doorstep. Her amber eyes, wide with exhaustion and something deeper, fear, locked onto his. Dangling from her jaws was a tiny, whimpering puppy, its fragile body barely moving. Johnson dropped to a knee, instinct taking over, reaching out slowly. The mother hesitated, then placed the puppy at his feet before taking a staggering step back, her body swaying, ready to collapse. "Jesus!" Torres whispered behind him. Johnson scooped up the tiny creature, pressing it against his chest. Its fur was wet and chilled, but the faint rise and fall of its chest reassured him. The mother turned sharply, eyes darting toward the empty street beyond the station. Then, before anyone could stop her, she bolted back into the storm, her legs wobbling yet determined. "She's leaving," Torres shouted. "She's coming back," Johnson muttered, already running inside to wrap the puppy in his jacket. She wouldn't have made the trip just for one. As if to prove his point, barely a minute passed before the frantic scratching returned. When Johnson flung the door open, the mother dog was there again, panting heavily, another puppy clenched carefully in her jaws. She dropped it at his feet just as before, eyes flickering with something pleading. One by one, the cycle repeated, the exhausted mother disappearing into the night and returning with another pup. Each time, she struggled more, her steps slower, her frame sagging under the weight of her mission. Johnson and Torres worked quickly, drying and warming the pups, wrapping them in spare uniforms. The rest of the station soon gathered, watching in astonishment as the mother returned again and again, relentless despite her weakening body. When she finally arrived with the last pup, she collapsed the moment she stepped inside. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her ribs rising and falling erratically beneath her muddied coat. Johnson knelt beside her, carefully running a hand down her shaking frame. She didn't resist. There was no strength left in her to do so. "She's done," Torres said softly. "She gave everything she had to get them here." Johnson looked at the bundle of pups huddled together on the makeshift bed of blankets they had arranged. 5 tiny lives, all of them saved because of her. "Get the vet on the line," Johnson ordered. "She needs help now." As Torres moved to the phone, Johnson focused on the mother, brushing damp fur away from her face. "You're safe now," he murmured. "No one's gonna hurt you here." And then he noticed it, the faint, almost invisible scars along her muzzle, the raw patches near her ears, the signs of old wounds, ones that hadn't healed properly. A pit settled in his stomach. Someone had hurt her before. Someone had abandoned her. But she hadn't given up. She had fought against the odds, braved the storm, and carried her babies to the only place she believed they would be safe. And Johnson had every intention of making sure she was right. Officer Johnson sat beside the German Shepherd, his fingers gently tracing the damp fur along her neck as she struggled to breathe. The soft rise and fall of her ribs were uneven, her exhaustion bone-deep. The station was quiet now, save for the soft murmurs of the other officers tending to the 5 tiny puppies wrapped in blankets. The vet had been called and was on the way, but Johnson couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in his gut. Something about this wasn't just a stray dog in distress. She wasn't running randomly. She was running from something. Torres crouched next to him, eyes flicking between the mother and her pups. "You think she belongs to someone?" he asked, voice low. Johnson exhaled slowly, studying the scars along the dog's muzzle, the way she flinched slightly when he moved too quickly. "I don't know," he admitted, though his gut told him otherwise. "But someone hurt her before." He could see it in the way she held herself, tense, guarded, even as exhaustion threatened to pull her under. Her trust had been broken before, and yet, against all odds, she had come here. Not to an abandoned barn or a stranger's porch, but to them. To the police. A distant sound outside caught his attention. The low rumble of an engine idling just beyond the rain. Johnson's spine stiffened as he exchanged a glance with Torres, who immediately stood and moved toward the window. The headlights of a vehicle, barely visible through the sheets of rain, flickered near the station's entrance before disappearing into the darkness. "Black truck," Torres muttered. Johnson felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. That same truck had been circling the station earlier, and now, after the dog had arrived, it was back. Coincidence? Maybe, but he didn't believe in coincidences. "I don't like this," Johnson said, standing slowly. He glanced down at the dog, whose ears twitched despite her exhaustion. She was listening, too. "Stay with her. I'm gonna check it out." Torres nodded, but before Johnson could reach the door, another officer, Grayson, stepped inside from the back lot, rain dripping from his uniform. "Hey," he said, shaking water from his sleeves. "There's a truck parked a few blocks down. No plates." Johnson's jaw tightened. "How long's it been there?" "No idea, but it's just sitting there, lights off." That was enough for him. His gut was already screaming that something wasn't right, and now the pieces were starting to fall into place. A dog running through the storm, desperate to get her puppies to safety. A vehicle lurking just outside, waiting. Johnson checked his holster out of habit before nodding to Grayson. "Let's take a drive." Torres hesitated. "What about her?" He nodded toward the dog, who had lifted her head just slightly, her eyes groggy but alert. "I think she'll be safer in here than out there," Johnson muttered before heading toward the door. The night was thick with rain, the kind that muffled sound and distorted movement. As Johnson and Grayson pulled out of the station's lot, the black truck came into view, parked at the edge of a dimly lit street, barely visible under the flickering glow of a broken street lamp. It was old, the kind of vehicle that had seen too many miles and too many years, its dark paint barely concealing the rust along the fenders. Johnson's grip tightened on the wheel. "Let's see who's so interested in our station." They pulled up behind the truck, flashing their patrol lights just once. The driver's silhouette shifted, hands gripping the steering wheel tight, but they didn't move to flee. "Not yet." Grayson leaned forward. "They don't want to run. Because they don't have to." Johnson put the car in park and reached for the radio. "Station, we got a black Ford pickup, no plates, occupied one time. Running point now." A static-filled acknowledgement crackled through, but before Johnson could exit the vehicle, the truck's engine roared to life. Tires screeched against wet pavement as the driver gunned it forward, fishtailing slightly before taking off down the road. "Damn it," Johnson growled, slamming the accelerator. The chase was immediate, the black truck weaving recklessly through the empty streets, tires splashing through deep puddles as it gained speed. Johnson stayed close, refusing to let them disappear into the storm. "Radio Torres, tell him to lock the station down," he barked, focusing on the vehicle in front of him. Grayson relayed the message, his voice tense. "Torres, lock it down. We're in pursuit." The truck swerved, nearly taking out a row of trash bins before skidding onto a narrow side street. Johnson cursed under his breath, gripping the wheel tight as he maneuvered around the tight corner. The chase wouldn't last long. The streets were slick, the truck was old, and whoever was behind the wheel was panicking. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The truck veered hard, tires unable to hold traction, and spun out onto the side of the road, slamming into a chain-link fence. The front end crumpled slightly, steam rising from beneath the hood. Johnson killed the sirens and threw the car into park. "Let's go." They moved fast, weapons drawn, rounding the front of their cruiser as the driver's side door of the truck creaked open. A man stumbled out, his figure barely visible in the rain, hands raised slightly. "Stay where you are," Johnson ordered, keeping his aim steady. The man hesitated before lifting his face toward them, and in that moment Johnson knew. He wasn't just some guy loitering near the station out of curiosity. There was recognition in his eyes, something cold and calculating despite his disheveled appearance. Grayson stepped forward. "Hands where we can see them. Now." The man smirked, lifting his hands higher. "Easy, officers. I was just out for a drive." Johnson ignored him, eyes narrowing as he noticed something in the truck's cab. A faint, muddy smear along the passenger seat. It was almost impossible to see in the darkness, but he knew exactly what it was. Paw prints. His stomach twisted. "You want to tell me why you've been sitting outside our station all night?" Johnson asked, voice dangerously calm. The man chuckled. "Just a coincidence." Johnson didn't believe in coincidences, and as he glanced back at the truck, he realized one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't over. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, but the tension in the air remained thick as Officer Johnson kept his weapon trained on the man standing before him. Every instinct screamed that this wasn't just a random pursuit, that the German Shepherd's desperate arrival at the station and this man's presence weren't unrelated. The suspect's smirk didn't waver, even as Grayson moved in to cuff him, securing his wrists behind his back with practiced ease. "Just out for a drive, huh?" Johnson muttered, stepping closer, his eyes scanning the truck's interior. The muddy paw prints on the seat confirmed what he already suspected. This man had something to do with Hope and her puppies. "Sure looks like you had company earlier." The man's smirk faltered, just for a second before he shrugged. "Dogs jump in cars all the time. Ain't a crime." His casual tone didn't match the flicker of unease in his eyes, and Johnson filed that away, knowing damn well this wasn't just a case of a stray hopping into the wrong vehicle. Grayson pulled the man back toward the patrol car, while Johnson opened the driver's side door, careful not to disturb any potential evidence. The interior smelled of damp leather and cigarettes, and on the floor of the passenger side, he spotted something that made his pulse quicken. A thick, frayed rope, knotted in several places, still damp from the rain. Beside it, a rag stained with something dark. Blood? Mud? He pulled out a pen and carefully lifted the edge of the rag, his jaw tightening as he recognized the unmistakable scent of dried sweat and fear. This wasn't just a man with bad luck. This was someone who had been transporting a dog under duress, probably more than one. "Got anything?" Grayson called from where he was securing the suspect in the back of the cruiser. Johnson straightened, casting one last look at the truck before shaking his head. "Nothing we can't figure out back at the station." He slammed the door shut, rain dripping from the brim of his hat as he turned to the man in cuffs. "What's your name?" The man shrugged, a lazy smirk curling at his lips again. "Don't see how that matters." Johnson exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. "It matters because I don't like people lurking around my station in the middle of the night, especially when they happen to be driving around with rope and bloody rags in their truck." Still, the man said nothing. Johnson studied him for a long moment before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small flashlight, flicking it on and directing the beam at the suspect's hands. Scratches. Deep, jagged ones, fresh enough that a few still had dried blood crusted along the edges. Johnson tilted his head. "Those look like bite marks to me." The man's smirk finally faded. Johnson took a slow step closer, lowering his voice. "You want to rethink your story?" The man swallowed, his gaze darting toward the truck before he forced his features back into something resembling indifference. "Look, I don't know what you think you're gonna find, but you got nothing on me. You saw a dog. I saw a dog. Maybe the damn thing ran into my truck earlier, got spooked, and ran off. That ain't a crime. Johnson clenched his jaw, every nerve in his body telling him this man was lying through his teeth. He didn't have the whole story yet, but he had enough to know Hope hadn't just stumbled into their station by chance. She had been running, and she had been running from him. Get him in the car, Johnson ordered, turning back toward their patrol vehicle. We'll see if he feels like talking once we're back at the station. As Grayson shoved the man into the back seat, Johnson made a quick call to dispatch, requesting a tow for the truck and an evidence team to go through it. Then he slid behind the wheel, adjusting the mirror so he could see their suspect's face in the reflection. The man stared back at him, unreadable, but there was something behind his eyes, something cold, something that told Johnson this wasn't the first time he had been in this situation. You ever own a dog? Johnson asked casually as he pulled the car back onto the main road. The man snorted. What? You think I'm some kind of animal lover? Johnson didn't answer, just let the question hang in the air. Because no, he didn't think this man loved animals. But he did think he knew exactly how to break them. The drive back to the station was silent, the weight of the night pressing in from all sides. When they pulled into the lot, Torres was already waiting outside, arms crossed as he watched them approach. Johnson barely had time to step out of the car before Torres motioned him over, lowering his voice. The vet just left. Hope's got some deep wounds, but nothing life-threatening. She's severely underweight, though, and there's signs of past injuries, repeated ones. His jaw tensed. That dog's been through hell, Johnson. Johnson sighed, scrubbing a hand over his face. And I think I just met the guy who put her there. Torres glanced at the patrol car, his expression darkening. That him? Yeah, he won't talk, but he's got bite marks all over his hands, and his truck's a mess. There were paw prints on the seat, rope, bloodstains. Torres shook his head. Damn. Johnson nodded toward the station. Get him processed. I want to see if he's got priors. Maybe shake loose something useful. As Torres led the man inside, Johnson took a deep breath, letting the rain cool the fire simmering in his chest. Then he turned toward the side entrance, where Hope and her puppies were still resting. The room was quiet when he stepped inside, the only sound the soft breathing of the puppies nestled together in a pile of blankets. Hope lifted her head slightly when she saw him, her eyes still clouded with exhaustion but aware. Johnson crouched beside her, reaching out slowly until his fingers brushed the damp fur along her ear. You're safe now, he murmured, watching as her eyes fluttered shut again. I promise. He had no idea how deep this went, but one thing was clear, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The station was quieter than usual, a thick tension settling in the air like an unspoken warning. Officer Johnson sat in the dimly lit break room, his fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His mind raced through the details of the night, replaying every moment like a reel of film stuck on an endless loop. The German Shepherd, Hope, as they had started calling her, was resting in the back room, her pups curled against her, safe for now. But safe wasn't permanent. Not when men like the one sitting in their holding cell existed. Johnson exhaled slowly, pushing back his exhaustion as he stood and walked down the narrow hallway toward the cells. The man, now identified as Travis Moore, thanks to a quick records check, was sitting on the bench inside, his hands resting on his knees, his expression as unreadable as ever. The metal bars cast long, distorted shadows across his face as he lifted his gaze, eyes sharp but devoid of any real concern. You look like a man with questions, Moore drawled, tilting his head slightly. Shame I don't got many answers for you. Johnson didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned against the bars, letting the silence stretch between them, watching for any flicker of discomfort. Moore held his gaze, unbothered, as if he had been in this situation too many times before to care. You ever hear of a dog named Hope? Johnson finally asked, keeping his voice even. Moore chuckled, shaking his head. Sounds like a name some bleeding heart shelter worker came up with. Ain't my dog. If that's what you're skin. Johnson's jaw tightened. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone and swiping to a photo he had taken earlier that night. A close-up of Hope's injuries, the deep scars along her muzzle, the patches of missing fur. He held it up just enough for Moore to see. Then explain this. Moore barely glanced at it before smirking. Looks like she got herself into trouble. Ain't got nothing to do with me. You sure about that? Johnson pressed. Because we found paw prints in your truck. Fresh ones. Truck's been sittin' in the rain. Ain't my fault if some stray decided to take a nap inside. Johnson studied him, searching for cracks in the performance, but Moore was too good at this. Too practiced. This wasn't just a random guy with a bad attitude. This was someone who had done this before, who knew exactly how to toe the line between denial and truth. You know, Johnson said after a moment, slipping his phone back into his pocket. I did a little digging on you while you were sitting here. Real quiet like. You got a record, Moore. Small stuff at first. Couple of assault charges that got dropped. Then some bigger ones, illegal breeding, dogfighting accusations, nothing that stuck, though. Guess you're real good at slipping through the cracks. Moore's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second before he shrugged. Ain't illegal to own dogs. No, but it is illegal to abuse them, to force them to fight, to make money off their suffering. Johnson pushed off the bars, pacing slowly in front of the cell. See, I think Hope wasn't just a stray. I think she was yours, and I think she got away. Moore leaned back against the wall, crossing one ankle over the other. That's a nice story, officer. You should write a book. You know what I think happened? Johnson continued, ignoring the comment. I think Hope was meant to be bait. That's why she's covered in scars, right? She wasn't a fighter. She was the one thrown into the ring to test the real fighters. And maybe, just maybe, you thought she was too broken to be worth keeping around. Maybe she ran, maybe you let her go. But what you didn't expect, what you never planned for, was her coming back. Not for herself, but for them. Moore's foot tapped against the concrete floor, a steady rhythm that didn't quite match his otherwise calm demeanor. You got a real imagination, you know that? Johnson stopped pacing, turning to face him fully. You messed up tonight, he said simply. Showing up near the station? Sticking around long enough to get caught? That's not something a careful man does. That's something a man in a panic does. So tell me, Moore, what were you so afraid of? Silence. Then, finally, Moore let out a slow, low chuckle, shaking his head. You talk a big game, he said. But you ain't got proof of nothing. You got a truck with some mud in it. You got a stray dog who don't belong to me. And you got a whole lot of theories that won't hold up in court. Johnson knew he was right, for now, but that wouldn't last. You're gonna slip up, Johnson said, voice calm but firm. Guys like you always do. He turned without another word, leaving Moore sitting in the dim glow of the cell, his smirk returning just as the door swung shut. Outside, Torres was waiting, arms crossed. Well? Johnson shook his head. He's not talking, but we both know he's involved. Torres sighed. So what now? Johnson exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Now we find out where he came from, who he was working with, and most importantly, how many more dogs are still out there, waiting for someone to save them. As if on cue, a soft whimper echoed down the hallway. Hope. Johnson straightened, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just about one dog anymore. It never was. This was about something bigger, something worse. And he wasn't going to stop until he brought every single person responsible to justice. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a dull, gray light over the town as Officer Johnson stepped out of the station. The night had been long, and exhaustion sat heavy in his bones, but sleep was the last thing on his mind. Moore was sitting in a holding cell, smug and silent, knowing there wasn't enough hard evidence to keep him for long. Every second that passed was another second closer to him walking free, to more dogs suffering under his hand. Johnson clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening into fists at his sides. He wasn't going to let that happen. Hope had fought too hard to get here, had risked everything to bring her puppies to safety. She hadn't run from nothing. She had run because she knew what would happen if she stayed. And now it was Johnson's turn to fight for her. Torres joined him on the front steps, sipping coffee from a styrofoam cup, dark circles under his eyes. "You really think we can nail this guy?" he muttered, watching as the town slowly came to life around them. "We have to," Johnson said simply, his mind already working through the next steps. Moore wasn't going to give them anything willingly. They needed something more, something concrete. He turned back toward the station. "I'm going to talk to Hope again." Torres raised an eyebrow. "Pretty sure she doesn't speak English." Johnson ignored the comment, pushing through the doors and heading toward the back room where Hope and her puppies were resting. The moment he stepped inside, Hope lifted her head, ears flicking forward, her eyes tracking his movements carefully. The puppies were still curled against her side, their tiny bodies rising and falling in unison. Johnson knelt beside her, reaching out slowly, giving her the chance to pull away if she wanted to. But she didn't. Instead, she sniffed his hand, then pressed her cold nose against his palm. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. She trusted him. "Good girl," he murmured, scratching gently behind her ears. She let out a low sigh, her body relaxing slightly. "I need your help, Hope." He glanced at the scars along her muzzle, the ones that told a story of pain and survival. There was something there. Something she had been trying to tell them all along. He just needed to figure out what. Then it hit him. Her collar. Johnson muttered, standing abruptly. Torres, who had followed him inside, frowned. "What about it?" "She wasn't wearing one when she got here," Johnson said. "But that doesn't mean she never had one." He turned back to Hope, his heart pounding. "Where did you come from, girl?" Hope blinked at him, then slowly shifted, pulling herself to her feet. She was still weak, but there was a determination in her stance that hadn't been there before. Johnson watched as she padded toward the door, pausing only to glance back at him. Torres let out a low whistle. "You think she wants us to follow her?" Johnson didn't hesitate. "I think it's worth finding out." They moved quickly, grabbing their gear and loading into the patrol car. Hope sat in the back, her eyes fixed on the world beyond the window, her ears twitching at every passing sound. Johnson had no idea where she was leading them, but he had learned to trust his gut, and his gut told him that she knew exactly where she was going. The road stretched on for miles, winding through backcountry fields and abandoned lots, the kind of places people didn't pay much attention to. Hope stayed alert, her nose pressed against the glass until finally she moved. A low whine escaped her throat, and she shifted anxiously, her paws pressing against the seat. Johnson slowed the car, following her gaze. Up ahead, half hidden by overgrown weeds and rusted fences, was a rundown property. A battered barn sat in the distance, its roof caving in at the edges, the paint peeling like dead skin. And parked just outside another truck. Not the same one from last night, but similar. Too similar. Torres cursed under his breath. "You think this is it?" Johnson nodded, his grip tightening on the wheel. "I think we just found where she came from." They radioed for backup, but Johnson didn't wait. He couldn't. Every second mattered. He stepped out of the car, hand on his holster, moving slowly through the tall grass. Hope was right beside him, her body tense, her ears forward. She knew this place. She remembered it, and she was afraid. The barn smelled of damp wood and decay, the scent of unwashed animals thick in the air. Johnson's pulse hammered in his ears as he pushed open the door, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The sight that met him made his stomach churn. Cages. Row after row of rusted metal cages, some empty, others still occupied by trembling, malnourished dogs. Their eyes shone in the dim light, filled with the same desperation he had seen in Hope's. They didn't bark. They didn't move. They had been taught that noise meant pain. Johnson swallowed back the bile rising in his throat. "We need to get them out of here," he said, voice tight. Torres was already on his radio, calling it in, but Johnson didn't wait. He moved toward the nearest cage, kneeling beside a small, shaking pit bull, its ribs pressing against its skin. "You're safe now," he whispered, reaching for the latch. The lock was old, rusted. It snapped easily beneath his grip. A noise from the back of the barn sent his adrenaline spiking. A door creaked open, heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor. Johnson turned just as a figure emerged from the shadows. A man, mid-40s, broad-shouldered, his expression twisting into something ugly when he saw them. "You got no business here," the man snarled, his hand twitching toward his belt. Johnson took a slow step forward, keeping his voice level. "You're done," he said simply. "We've got everything we need. The dogs, the truck, more in a holding cell running out of excuses." The man hesitated, his jaw tightening. Then, in a blur of movement, he reached for something. Johnson didn't wait to see what. "Don't!" The command was sharp, edged with authority. And for a split second, the man froze, just long enough for Torres to rush in, gun drawn, backup flooding into the barn behind him. Within seconds, the man was on the ground, cuffs snapping around his wrists. It was over. Johnson exhaled, running a hand over his face, his heart still hammering. The dogs were being carried out one by one, blankets draped over their frail bodies. And Hope was standing beside him, watching it all, her tail flicking once. "You did good, girl," he murmured, kneeling beside her. She pressed her nose into his palm, her body finally relaxing. In the end, the case unraveled quickly. Moore cracked under pressure, flipping on his partners in exchange for a lighter sentence. The entire operation collapsed within days, arrests piling up like dominoes. But none of it would have happened without her. Without Hope. She had saved them all. And when the dust settled, when the cages were empty and the barn was nothing more than another scar on the landscape, Johnson made a decision. Hope wasn't going anywhere. She had fought for her family, for herself. Now, she had a new one, and this time no one was ever going to hurt her again. Thank you for watching this incredible story of courage, resilience, and hope. If you were moved by Hope's journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming and inspiring stories. Your support helps us continue bringing powerful tales like this to life. Stay tuned for our next story. You won't want to miss it. See you soon.